Um, so yes, thank you for the introduction. I'm Natasha Bartolotta. I'm the Science and Stewardship Manager up at the National Loon Center. We are up in Cross Lake, just north of Brainerd. Um, and we are a nonprofit. We'll share a little bit about the Loon Center and what we do at the start, but also talk about iNaturalist and its use in community science and research, and how it's used with loons, but also with birds. As you can imagine, I have a little bit of a bias around birds, and so that's most of the projects that I've highlighted in there. But iNaturalist is definitely useful for a variety of species. And for my background, I did start out after getting my degree in biological sciences in primatology. I wanted to be Jane Goodall, who of course passed away recently. She was a big influence on a lot of people, including me. And I did get to go study wild chimpanzees and follow in her footsteps, but I did have a little bit of a change of path afterwards, and ended up getting on quite a journey before I ended up in Minnesota. I grew up in New York State and Connecticut, and I then spent a little bit of time in Pennsylvania working at a zoo, as a conservation educator before going down to Louisiana to do coastal bird stewardship with Audubon. And then after spending a summer on the beach in Audubon in 90 degree, speaking of 90-degree weather, I decided to come up to Minnesota in polar opposite weather. And my family was all concerned about me. It's funny that we started talking about weather here because every person that I said to that I was going to go to a job at the National Loon Center in Minnesota, I think their first response was, it's cold there, right? And but I've been here for now almost 4 years, and I've adapted to the cold, which is different from the cold out in Connecticut. It's much more mild out there. But I've adapted, persevered like a lot of bird species. And so, yes, I've been at the Loon Center for about 4 years now. The Loon Center itself was established in 2017 as a nonprofit by folks in Cross Lake. But we really got going in 2021. That was the year that we opened our temporary center, which is called The Nest, and that's in Cross Lake Town Square. And then we hired the first staff, starting with our executive director, and then myself and another staff member that fall. And then we have recently added additional staff members, an education manager, and an operations manager, and now a director of operations in this past year. And we'll be opening facility for 2027. And as a nonprofit, our mission is to restore and protect loon breeding habitats, and engage in research and education around loons in freshwater. And so we do research, education, and conservation now before we have our center in place. This photo here on the left for research, that's a dead loon that I picked up on my kayak. So we do some studies on mortality, and there is a way that connects back to iNaturalist. So I will get to that later on in the presentation, but to see live loons, that's our main flagship education program, is our loon pontoon, and we take folks out on Cross Lake and other lakes on the Whitefish chain of lakes to see loons, to go on loon research tours. And then in conservation, one project we're involved with is the Loon Restoration Project for the DNR and USGS, and have placed some nesting platforms as part of that project. And so just a brief primer about the Loon Center, the facility itself, before we get into the about iNaturalist. Just says, I do want to share a little bit about who we are in case any folks haven't heard of the Loon Center or what we're about. We will be opening this facility this fall. Some of the site prep work is going underway on some of the wells. We're aiming to be a net zero building and have gotten LCCMR funds towards the sustainable building design of this facility, like the solar panels here above the parking lot. And so some of that site prep work we're beginning this fall. And then over the winter, there'll be probably minimal activity. And then the main construction happening next year to hopefully open by May of 2027. And if you're familiar with the Cross Lake area, this um, campus site here, this is our campus site here. So Cross Lake itself, the lake is what's featured in the background. So we're not too far from Cross Lake. And then we have this 10 acres campus here. The southern end will maintain mostly natural spaces. And then the building itself, the parking lots, will be on that northern end where you see it's already partially developed. First, we will engage a lot of groups, families in the area, tourism, school students, and bird and nature enthusiasts like the Twin Cities Rotary EcoClub. I hope you come up to visit when we are open. And one of the key experiences in the building will be an ecosystem experience. And that will go, these are just some renderings right now with the exhibit design team. Just taken from some of our schematic design phases that we're in now, just to give a little bit of a sneak peek into what we're looking at. And one of those main experiences is the ecosystem experience, going through the life of the loon underwater, on the shoreline, and then up in the air. And that's just one section of the facility, and then there'll be main gallery spaces on the main floors, main two levels of the Loon Center. And we will have research stations as well, hopefully highlighting projects like iNaturalist, ways that people can get involved in getting involved with loon monitoring and other avian monitoring. Oh, and of course, this as we're still in our capital campaign. Of course, I'd like to mention that we have donation opportunities. We have here. It's kind of hard to explain that our parking lot will be shaped like a loon, and this paver here is actually the bill of the loon leading up to the center, with the goal that these kind of plant-like features here will be a nod to the natural shorelines that loons nest on, and that will be where we have some donation opportunity, exterior donation, donor recognition opportunities for groups or individuals. And that's something if you're interested in, definitely reach out to us. But I mostly want to see if that as a primer to who we are, where I work, and where I'm coming from today to talk to you. But now to get into really what we want to talk about iNaturalist, I want to start as well with a primer about the app itself, just in case anyone is not as familiar. So iNaturalist is you might hear it referred to in a few different ways, from participatory science, citizen science, to community science, all kind of basically meaning just anyone, members of the public, can submit observations and contribute to the science. And how iNaturalist works is that it's a global feature you can use on a desktop or have an app on your phone, and you can take a picture of either any type of animal or plant and submit that to iNaturalist. So you can see here, just you open the home page and you see the Explore page, just the sheer number of observations that have been submitted across the world. And you can see some of the most recent observations that people have made, including this lesser stag beetle. And so it's just also a fun way to just see and learn more about the world around you from your backyard, to just maybe explore what people are seeing in a different country or a different continent. And in case anyone is not as familiar with iNaturalist, I did want to do a brief demonstration of how to upload an observation. But before I get into that demonstration, I want to explain a little bit more about the photo that I'm using for the demo. So in this photo here, we have a loon. You might notice it looks a little bit different from what we see of loons typically during the breeding season. And you might even notice, looking at this loon, it actually looks a little bit different from common loon that we usually see. The bill is a little bit narrower. Its head and neck is a little bit smaller. This is a photo that I took of a different species of loon, not in Minnesota. And so there are 4 other species of loons: the red-throated loon, Pacific loon, Arctic loon, and yellow-billed loon. And this photo here is of a Pacific loon in its wintering plumage. And so in Minnesota, we have the common loon that breeds here. So otherwise known as the Great Northern Diver, breeding on northern freshwater lakes. We mostly see them in their territorial pairs. The loon itself, with for the loon across the 5 species, it probably comes from a Scandinavian word meaning clumsy, as they can't really walk on land as their legs are so far back on their body. So that's a fun trivia fact I like to point out. And they're one of our oldest living lineages of birds, most closely related to penguins. So those are a couple of fun facts I wanted to point out. And so typically in Minnesota, we really only see the common loon. But where iNaturalist can come into is with our learning about all species of loons and learning about them outside of breeding season. Because in Minnesota, I'll have a slide on this farther on, but in other states, there are usually dedicated programs, maybe through an organization like ours or through a state program in Minnesota, it's the DNR, that will do monitoring for species like the loon during the breeding season. But then we have the whole rest of their life where they're migrating. They're for loons up in the upper Midwest, following the Mississippi Flyway down to the Gulf Coast or the Southern Atlantic coast. And iNaturalist, other apps like eBird that really can provide invaluable data about loons' movement across their entire life. And this, of course, goes for other birds too. So loons are a migratory species. Talking about the change from summer to fall, for my world, it's a little bittersweet because the loons are leaving, and soon my day will look up less time spent out on the lake seeing loons and more time doing all the behind the scenes stuff and looking at the computer. But it's also nice because then we're past our main busy season and we get a little bit of a breather. So it's bittersweet. But I love this photo of the loon here. You can really see just how narrow their wings are compared to their body size. They're definitely more hydrodynamic than they are aerodynamic, but they do fly quite a ways down. I mean, they're going to stop at stopover lakes like the Great Lakes and lakes inland. And so sightings that are reported on iNaturalist or through eBird, can help us track migration, can help us track their wintering and monitor them through their whole life cycle. And iNaturalist specifically is really interesting for loons during their migration and just based on the fact that it's based off of photos. And so I don't know that if there is an active research project right now looking at this, but there could be potential for anyone that was interested in looking at molting of loons and the changes in their plumage. Just having the photos that are submitted by iNaturalist, you can get so much data and information from those photos themselves. So this photo on the left here is a photo of a loon going into partial molt, still on Cross Lake, still in Minnesota, but you could see just already the changes in its plumage. Or you could maybe see some interesting behavior that's documented in photos, like this photo on the right of what we would consider a social gathering. So loons that are tolerating other loons being in their space, for earlier in the season, typically they're in their territorial pairs, but we start to see some of the social gatherings farther on in July or August. And it's just, it's really invaluable data that what you can get from a photo. And so there's just so much potential there. And the great thing about iNaturalist is then you have the record there, and anyone that's interested could go in and look and filter in through the data and look at differences in plumage. Like example here, you could, if you're seeing some different photos of loons that are submitted maybe at this time of year, and you know what to look for, you could point out the differences between adult and wintering plumage and the juvenile. So on the left is an adult transitioning into the winter plumage. You could see just the grayish feathers, but you could see kind of those remnants of that black and white checkered pattern on the back. But then on the right here, this is a juvenile, which I could tell from the really distinct white edges, what we call scalloped feathering around the loon. And if someone submits a photo of a loon, maybe on a lake on northern Minnesota in October or so, I could look at that and know if it's an adult that's still on the lake, maybe staying later than usual, or if it's a juvenile that's on the lake. And iNaturalist can be an opportunity to also look at genealogy and look at timing. It could be a place where before the main loon monitoring program starts, where you could submit really interesting data. Like here in April on Cross Lake, April 28th, this was my first summer in Minnesota, and I was pretty surprised to have it be April 28th, and all of Cross Lake was mostly frozen still. And just the northern end of Cross Lake was open, and I counted about 100 loons and then other species of ducks, uh, and just all kinds of birds that were here congregating in this open area of the lake. That is, if you hear my dog barking, I think he sees someone walking past our house, but hopefully that's not getting picked up on my microphone. So I mentioned that the iNaturalist could be really interesting for studying a phenology of spring migration, like knowing if capturing some of these really interesting observations where we see a group of loons congregating like this before maybe they're moving farther north before other loons are like thaw out. And it can help us really understand what's going on in these yellow and blue zones on the breeding range of the common loon. So the orange here is the entire range of the loon. Orange here is the breeding range, And in a lot of these areas, there are dedicated citizen science programs. In Canada, there's Birds Canada, and there's different, so to speak, loon watch programs in the Northeast, Wisconsin, Minnesota. Um, but we can really use iNaturalist and eBird data to look at migration routes and look at this wintering range along the coast and even inland. So yeah, like I mentioned before, in Minnesota, there is a participatory science program to observe loons during the breeding season through the Minnesota DNR. And there's two different opportunities: Loon Watcher and the Minnesota Loon Monitoring Program. But those are typically going through May through August. So going now back to the photo that I wanted to share for the demonstration of Pacific loon. I mentioned before this was not seen in Minnesota. I actually saw this loon in South Carolina during a loon wintering research program, which is very unusual. As you can see, the range here for Pacific loons is pretty much way north. This one was definitely lost. And yeah, so it's at South Carolina, a lake called Lake Jocassee, where there's a loon wintering research program and a loon migration program. And there's a couple more photos that I got of that Pacific loon, just showing on the top here, the Pacific loon compared to a common loon in the wintering plumage, and you can see some of the differences between them there. So if I wanted to submit this observation, because that's really interesting that we saw a Pacific loon in South Carolina, way outside of its typical range. This was in March of 2023. I could upload that to iNaturalist, and hopefully you can see the screen here of iNaturalist that's worked earlier. And you could do this in the moment on your phone. But in this case, I took a picture on my camera and I wanted to come back and upload it later. And so I would upload the photo that I have of the Pacific loon. And the really interesting and neat thing with iNaturalist is you can upload photos from any time that you've taken something. I've uploaded photos that I've taken from a few years ago before I started using iNaturalist, and your data just gets contributed there. And since there's already information on the photo itself, on the date and time, that automatically uploaded, but one thing that I'd have to do is go in and search for the location. And usually this takes a little bit of finagling, and so I knew where I was on the lake when I saw that was actually more over here. And you can, if you're trying to keep something and have it be not exactly pinpoint, maybe you want to not have people going to the species you're seeing. You might do a wide radius, or you could do obscured or private, and that protects like endangered species, vulnerable species, like especially things like owls. Oops, my marker got off track here. So maybe I just want to say generally it was seen on Lake Jocassee. I could do this really large radius here, zoom in. And then now we have the location. If I wanted to put any interesting notes, I could put that in there, but really the basis is just the species. And this is actually a good example of how iNaturalist actually has a really good learning algorithm that will oftentimes automatically identify your species, but sometimes it's not always correct. So definitely go in and make sure you're verifying that. Or if I wasn't sure what type of loon this was, I could just put it at the genus level and just put loon. And the really great thing about iNaturalist is that it revolves around having other people verify your sighting. So someone else who might be more familiar with loon species might come in and verify what you saw. So for example, here's a common loon sighting. And this is on the Loon Center's account, and so we don't have as many observations here. We mostly have this for projects. So on my personal account, I have a lot more observations, but one that we've done for Loon Center, the common loon, you can see here that some other folks have verified that it's a common loon, and so now it's research grade. Another thing here, this will come in late as we're talking about the projects. You can select annotations, so you don't do this at the time of observing, but these are also really helpful for research projects, and you'll see that through getting later to say if it's alive or dead. evidence of presence. It's an adult, male or female. You can't tell by loons looking at them if they're male or female, so I can't select if that's male or female on this photo, but I put what annotations I can. Okay, so just wanted to give a quick primer on uploading an observation, just in case anyone's not as familiar, and to just show how it works. And hopefully we're back, everyone can see back at my slideshow here. So iNaturalist, then you have this repository of all these pictures and all these observations, and other folks are coming in and they're verifying what you see. It's a really great like community aspect to it too. But then what you can do for research projects or for things like BioBlitzes is that you can then filter observations into a certain project, and that can be based on specific species, a specific area, a specific date. And so one example of a project through iNaturalist is the City Nature Challenge, and the Loon Center, we host a project for the Brainerd Lakes area. I think the University of Minnesota Extension will do one for the Twin Cities, and there might be a few others in Minnesota, but we do one for up in the Brainerd Lakes area, so we just set our region for anywhere around that zone. Really, I put it as all of Crow Wing County. And then the City Nature Challenge is usually through 4 days at the end of April. And that's a project really just aimed to get people out and documenting biodiversity, just anything that we see during this window of time. And they've gotten, 3 million plus observations in 2025. This is data from this past year. Over 70,000 species and just over 100,000 people that participate in this. And so this is just an example of really like how iNaturalist can be used to document biodiversity, and just reporting observations and seeing what's out there at a certain window of time. And they've been doing that for 10 years. And so now they can look at biodiversity that's been reported over time, and they can get some really interesting trends just from that snapshot. And there's people that participate, organizations that will host for a certain area across the world. So we're getting global data for this project. And the great thing about these projects is you don't have to be on iNaturalist in the project, so to speak, to have it. Usually they work by just filtering in any observations in that time frame and in that geographic range into the project. But with the photos I mentioned, you can get into things that are a little more specific than just documenting what's there. You can get information from the photos themselves. And I mentioned those annotations, specifically the live versus dead. So there will be a little couple photos that you might see of dead birds on the future slides, just as a forewarning. Because one area we're getting into a more specific project that iNaturalist is useful for is I know of several areas that are doing bird window collision monitoring, and this is just one example of one down in Louisiana, where they use iNaturalist as a platform to document their observations. I just have to pause, mute for 1 second. My dogs are getting a little out of hand. Sorry about that. My two dogs decided right now, as pretty much the moment when I started to speak, that they wanted to be running around the house and playing and making a lot of noise. And so hopefully you couldn't hear that, but it was certainly distracting me. So that's just going in the other room. So getting back to where I was saying before, through bird collision monitoring, this has been done in a few different cities that are using iNaturalist to get some real life tracking on how window strikes are affecting birds. There's some data out there through Audubon or the American Bird Conservancy, just how many millions of birds have been lost over time through emerging factors. And one of those could be bird collisions with windows, especially during migration. And so projects like this that are getting data on bird collision monitoring, that can have real effects on policy and on management strategies. There are cities now that are doing lights out initiatives during migration for birds, or they're maybe looking into using bird safe glass. At the Loon Center for the future facility, we're going to be using things like bird safe glass to make sure that any windows on our building won't result in bird collisions. and that's due from research like this that is showing that bird collisions or window collisions for birds, especially songbirds, could have a significant impact. And in this project, I know they use iNaturalist as a platform. They do a training and they have um, volunteers maybe doing specific routes, surveying around certain buildings in a city. And each window collision monitoring project is a little different, but several of them I do know use iNaturalist as the location where they um, host their project and their data. And so that's one aspect of where you can use iNaturalist for birds. And then another case where you can get some more specific data is, in this case, on their feeding ecology. And so this is a project that I know of on eastern red crossbills. It was shared in my listservs for the Minnesota Ornithologist Union, asking for folks to submit information to this project. And they're looking to see what types of food and what conifers are most important to these eastern red crossbills, and maybe at what times of years. So in this project, there's observations of the bird itself that are being reported, but also you can see this third photo here showing the cones. That's another thing that they were asking for, was not pictures of the bird itself, but pictures of the cones that any of the crossbills were feeding on in the trees so that they could get information on their diet. So this is an example of, an avian project, but trying to get observations and information on their diet through pictures of both the bird and the species. So that was looking at areas around the Great Lakes, the East, the Northeast. And you can see here they filtered the project for just one type of species, and they've got about 100 observations in there. So those are two examples of projects. And again, these projects on iNaturalist, they take reports that are being submitted by users and are kind of just filtering based on a set parameters into a project that's set up. So for the Loon Center, we have projects in a couple cases on a little more of a morbid topic on loon mortality. So looking at the mortality can give us some insights into what's going on with loon survival, especially on their wintering grounds. And so for the Loon Center, I've set up a couple projects on iNaturalist to try to look at loon mortality, specifically on certain ranges of their wintering grounds in North America. And so one project that I have set up here is for the Atlantic and Gulf Coast. And that will be where loons from the upper Midwest, probably Eastern Canada and the Northeast that are breeding in those areas are wintering. And how this project was set up, again, is through set requirements. So I set it to the highest level where someone might select a loon, so that just any types of loons are being submitted, because just in case, if we wanted to look at just common loons specifically, but sometimes you might have red-throated loons put in there, but things could be misidentified, so you don't want to miss any observation. So I put it as high as I could, and then selected certain locations, and so that they could be research grade or still need an ID, need a photo. And then this is the key point, is that the annotation has to be that someone has selected dead. But of course, there's a lot of photos that are uploaded and people don't necessarily go in afterwards and update those annotations. So we could be missing some data for this project, but that's where, having people that are using iNaturalist and maybe aren't submitting photos, but are just going through and adding as many annotations as possible, or, helping with IDs, that's helping with research projects like this too, because that's a big effort that, don't necessarily have a lot of researchers have, is to go through and be going through all of those photos and selecting those annotations. So here's an example here of that, the geographic range here, where we've gotten reports all across the Atlantic coast and then the Gulf Coast for where dead loon has been reported. And you can see at the bottom an example of just the range. We were able to get the actual bird to even just from someone found a skull washed on a beach or certain bones. And you might be thinking, could someone actually identify a loon based off just certain bones? And I do know a veterinary pathologist who's done maybe near 1,000 loon necropsies, and so he could certainly probably ID a loon based off certain bones. So that could be helpful. Just there's probably some expert somewhere really who can identify a photo based off certain parts of the organism. So that gets a little bit morbid, and I apologize. There's gonna be a few more, or this should be the last slide here about any dead birds on it. But as I was looking to iNaturalist for recording loon mortalities, it led me to the Atlantic Marine Bird Cooperative, which is a group of various organizations that get together looking at avian management across the Atlantic coast. And I specifically got involved with the working group on community science and avian health, as there was some interest there in monitoring mortalities and health all along the Atlantic coast related to the HPAI outbreak, which is a highly pathogenic avian influenza outbreak. And so using iNaturalist, we set up a larger project for beached birds along the Atlantic coast, and that just filtered in any of the selected species we had. We did it mainly for the Atlantic Marine Bird Cooperative. It's mostly marine and seabirds. So we filtered in different types of species. It included loons. And that went all into this really large project. And then that actually resulted into a scientific publication on the use of here the strengths and limitations of participatory science to characterize a wildlife mass mortality event. Long title. Basically, we were looking at the effectiveness of iNaturalist in documenting that HPAI outbreak, which, for the record, didn't seem to, to our knowledge, affect loons as it did as any other species. I don't think we're certain why it hasn't affected loons and other species. There's been pretty low records of loons that were deceased because of HPAI. So really, for this publication here, there's a few other key species that they're looking at. Particularly, I know they're looking at gannets was one of the really affected species. But the folks that were really looking into this were actually based in Canada. And so they ended up taking that Beach Birds project and then making a project kind of subset of that really just focused in on Eastern Canada for the purpose of having a comparison, because they had a very comprehensive data set for Canada mortalities from agencies and through some of these systematic reporting methods for mortality, and they wanted to see how the iNaturalist data set compared to that comprehensive data set. And so this was based on the time period of the peak of the outbreak between 2021 and 2022. And so when they compared the really comprehensive data set to iNaturalist data set, found a couple of things. So the comprehensive data set they had over 40,000 mortalities that were reported. On iNaturalist, I think there were a couple hundred that ended up getting filtered into this project through the parameters that they set up for looking at Eastern Canada and filtering. And here they put it pretty generally, put birds of any type, and again with that dead annotation. And they put it at the peak outbreak for April 1st of 2022 through September 30th of 2022. And so you got less number of birds that were reported as mortalities, but there was some overlap in that the same key species were identified. So like gannets, they saw a high amount of gannet mortality in that overall comprehensive data set. And they also saw that was one of the more highly reported loon mortality, or not loon mortalities, avian mortalities in this iNaturalist data set. So iNaturalist could help identify what the key species that are affected during a mortality or disease outbreak are. And there was some overlap with the kind of the core period. So at like the peak time when there was a lot of bird mortalities that were being reported, that there is overlap between what they were getting through that comprehensive reporting system and through what people were just reporting what they were seeing, maybe as they were walking along the beach and just seeing things wash ashore and reporting that to iNaturalist. And then there is pretty good overlap with just the geographic distribution of where they were seeing these large mortalities reported through these agencies, and then where people were reporting seeing them on iNaturalist. So that got some really insightful, look into how iNaturalist could help in the cases where we might be seeing more emerging diseases outbreaks, and particularly just how iNaturalist could be used as a real-time reporting alert, because I mentioned you can use it on your phone, so you have people that could be reporting, a mass mortality event for birds or other species in real time. You have your phone, you could take the picture right there and post it, and you get, just maybe more effective reporting of things, or not more effective, but just very efficient and quick reporting of things like this, that could then, reach back to wildlife veterinarians, pathologists that are monitoring these types of events that might be looking at where, things that are being reported to iNaturalist. But there are definitely some limitations with iNaturalist. Again, they had to end up going through and manually select and annotate for birds to be having that dead annotation, realizing that they were missing a lot of data. And so I think that had added in a lot more observations after they went through and did that. And so that's definitely a constraint with this, is that it relies on people using the dead annotation and things like that. And that's not something that's, if you remember back to my live demonstration, when you're uploading the photo, you really are just getting the time, date, species, and location, and then you can go back in and afterwards and edit those annotations. And so part of this is just really getting the information out there that you can, adding in as much information as possible can help with these projects that are trying to filter in things based off some of those special annotations that go in to the observation afterwards. So there's, yeah, from this research, really just realizing that there's some outreach still to do on getting people to use iNaturalist, and then also, of course, just letting people know that you can report dead birds, and that's a little bit of a harder thing to get people excited about, wanting to report mortalities of birds, but it's really invaluable data, especially as we might be seeing other cases of disease outbreaks and things in the future. So that was an example of iNaturalist being used in something that resulted in scientific publication, but it can also just be a really handy tool in other ways for research. And I actually was using iNaturalist earlier this summer in relation to a common loon translocation project. So Minnesota, Loon Center, we sometimes call Minnesota the land of 10,000 lynx, the land of 12,000 loons, as that's our estimated population, and that's really only just 2% of the North American population, but it's the highest population in the continental United States. And through that statewide monitoring through the DNR program, we've seen that the population is relatively stable, but we have seen some loss of historical nesting across the entire breeding range. Some of those southern areas of their breeding range has pushed northwards, and that's including in Minnesota, or some areas of southern Minnesota where you might have had loons nesting within the last 100 years. We don't see that as well. And so there's a project called Restore the Call, working to try to restore loon populations to their former range, and they had success with translocating loons in Massachusetts. So they brought loons from, I think maybe from Maine, and released them on lakes in Massachusetts, and had seen success in that. Then they started breeding on those lakes in Massachusetts. And this was also done in Minnesota around the time of 2014 and 2016, where common loon chicks were translocated. So in this case, loons typically have 1 to 2 chicks. So if you had a pair that did have 2 chicks, one of the chicks was taken for the translocation project and brought down to lakes from Itasca County down to LeSueur County. This was done again about 10 years ago. And the hope was that then they would then essentially kind of imprint on those lakes, as loons typically return back near their natal lake or where they were born. So the hope was that they would spend enough time on these lakes to then kind of associate them and return back in the future to those lakes, and then start to breed and again, restore some of that historical breeding range for that the loons had. And so there was some follow-up work done in 2017, but we this year with our research advisory council identified that we wanted to do additional follow-up work on this project and go down to LeSueur County and see if we could do some surveys and see if there was any sightings of loons. Some of the loons were banded, the color bands on their legs, see if we could recite any of the banded loons from that project and see if there's any evidence of loons nesting on any of those release lakes. Because there's actually data missing from Loon Watch in LeSueur County they really have a lot of their data, I think, up in the main kind of breeding areas for loons, but we're missing some data outside of that. And so that's where we started looking to records like eBird and iNaturalist. Because we Fish Lake in LaSure County, that was one of the release lakes. So we were trying to look through about 9 mile radius of that lake. And there's still quite a bit of lakes there, and with just um, one of our scientific advisory council members used to work with the USGS and worked a lot with loons. Our summer intern got to go down and help with this, and then with just any volunteers that we were able to connect with over the summer, small team, we're trying to think how can we visit as many lakes as possible within a narrow window of time. And so we were trying to look at public records of loon sightings to see where loons might have been observed during the breeding season, to identify the lakes that would be probably the best to go to and survey during this follow-up work. And so I ended up looking at iNaturalist. We looked at eBird data, we looked at some of the Minnesota Ornithologist Union's data, but I also used iNaturalist because there were a few reports kind of around that area of where folks had seen, and they had seen loons and reported them. Here we were especially interested to see if there was anything in the mid-breeding season in recent years. And I saw one in July of 2024. Was able to look at those photos, because in some cases, like on some of the MOU records and eBird, loons were reported as maybe being in the non-breeding plumage, but that could have meant we could have subadults. And so without getting too much into the loon plumage, having the photos was also really helpful to look and see, okay, were these loons in breeding plumage that were spotted on these lakes, maybe additional signs that there could be loons breeding down here, that this project could have been successful. And so iNaturalist, was another tool that I used to try to figure out where we were going to survey the summer. And then we did end up going down there. I personally didn't get to go down, but they did see, I think, 0 loons total. Loons had been spotted in earlier seasons, and so hopefully we'll be able to get to do this again next year in May. I should mention we were going down in August by the time we were able to get this coordinated this year. So ideally we'll get to get down there earlier in the season next year and survey again. But we're hoping to do continued follow-up work to see if that type of project was successful. And in the future, iNaturalist, things like eBird, I think will be really key as we monitor loon populations and other avian populations, and really many species in the future, as things might be changing for the common loon. There's some models here. I have one from Audubon showing that there could still be continued shifting northward trends of their population if things continue as they are. If lakes keep warming, their wintering areas like coastal waters warm. So eBird, iNaturalist, things that we can use to study a species throughout its entire life history that can be helpful for monitoring things like this, for monitoring the future and conserving populations, avian populations, including the loon. It really, I think it's an invaluable tool. I really like iNaturalist and eBird, and I always am encouraging folks to use it. Anytime I do a loon specific talk, I'm always encouraging folks, especially knowing that some Minnesotans will go down to Florida or go down to warmer areas for the winter, to use eBird and iNaturalist to report your loon sightings, because we can just get so much of what we want to learn about loons outside of the breeding season, through these tools. And so this is just a little bit about the Loon Center to follow us in the future, to learn more about us. And we're up in Cross Lake. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer or try to answer.
Thanks, Natasha. This was super, super valuable. I had no idea that you could go into depth in your observations on iNaturalist. That's really great to learn.
Yeah, Natasha, I agree with what Kathy just said. It's interesting that part of the project is trying to relocate loons to some of the lakes in southern Minnesota, yet you said that water temperature due to climate change is creating this northward shift. So I'm just curious and why you decided to see if you could get them back into the southern lakes pardon?
Yeah, that was in 2014.
Yeah, that was a really good question. And that work was done through the Biodiversity Research Institute. And that is a great question that if there is a range in that one model that I've shown, I know that some biologists sometimes think that that might be more like the worst case scenario. And, it's really hard to predict these things and to know, and that's one model that's out there. Um, well, that is a good question, for us to be thinking about and for any project, especially a type translocation work, is it going to be worthwhile if there could be a northward trend? And in this case, the folks that were involved in that project when it started, 10 years ago, I think ultimately decided that it would be valuable and worthwhile to try to do that now. And I think the hope is that then with the work that we're doing with other loon organizations that are doing, just all environmental organizations doing that, we can prevent that northward shift from happening so that this active work to restore loons to their southern range is also coinciding with just efforts to conserve the population and make sure that they're staying within their breeding range here. And really, I think some of um, the loss of the southern habitat in Minnesota as well due to water quality reductions. And so, these efforts, of course, need to be coupled with just management and conservation, things that are happening on the land that's, affecting what's getting filtered into the water, so it's all, we definitely can't do like work like this in isolation too. And so that's a lot of what we do at the Loon Center as well, is trying to educate and use a loon into these larger topics so that these efforts for loons aren't being done like in a vacuum, that they're
Yeah.
being done in a way that's going to be sustainable and manageable. So hopefully that answers that question, but that is definitely a good question for sure.
No, it does answer the question. Thank you. And have you presented at the MOU research or paper session on this topic?
I have not.
Huh.
We nominate you.
Oh,
So I hope you can give a
So-
presentation
Yeah.
there.
yeah, I have not been to one of their paper sessions, but I do see them each year and hope to go. So maybe this will be the year.
Well, is Carol Henderson on the board?
He
Oh.
was on our board when my first year, so he was in his last year on the board, and so now his term is ended, but we stay in contact with him, and he was up. He came up for our Loons and Lakes Festival last summer, but yeah, definitely a wealth of knowledge that Carol has about loons and conservation in Minnesota.
Cool.
Natasha, this is Tim Deed. So one question or two things. The first one is, before iNaturalist and eBirds existed, the research must have just been much more difficult to do. I mean, it required, in person, or did people submit written records of what they saw? How did it work before things like iNaturalist came about?
That is a great question, and I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. As like on this level over on something global like this, I don't know if there was, to my knowledge, something where people could submit these observations. I could only think of it being, like a very species specific thing, like for the loons, like the loon monitoring program. That's always been something where people can submit their data in, and then, in this case, in Minnesota, DNR has all of their observations and their records there, but that's just for one species. Like I don't know if before iNaturalist there was something for all species in all like flora and fauna where you could
Sure.
submit your observations to.
Okay. That's
I
okay. That's okay.
Yeah.
So my second question just was, can you talk just a little bit more about these? It looked like you have like these pontoon boat tours out on the lake that take you. Can you just talk just a little bit more about, like, how does one sign up for those? Is it online registration? What do you do?
Sure, let's ask about that. So yeah, that's our loon pontoon, or the name of the boat, is called the Stewardship. So you might hear it referred to as either or. But that is an online registration. It's free to participate. All of our programs are pretty much free. And so for next summer, probably in April or so, we will have our schedule of programs on our website. And then it's just going there and selecting open dates that are available. And we have a few different programs. We have a general public tour that's about an hour and a half and usually goes on Cross Lake, and that's our general education talking about loons. And then this past year was a new program that we did called our Loon Research Tour, and that was a 3 hour tour. And we went to so Cross Lake is a part of the Whitefish chain of lakes, so there's 14 lakes that are connected, and so we went to other parts, different lakes of the chain each week, and we did a survey of nesting territories, and then later on through the summer, chicks, presence, productive success, and then towards the end of the fall, or not that fall, of the summer, in September, really, we started going to the larger lakes, because on our biggest lakes of the whitefish chain are lower and upper whitefish, and that's where we get large groups of loons that congregate and form feeding groups. So we got to see some of those with the research tour, and that was a really fun program. We're going to do that again next year too, and then just a few other programs we do is the Junior Loon Biologist program for kids 7 to 12. And we usually do special conservation workshops. And this past year, we started a few photography workshops as well. So those will generally be the main programs that will continue through next year. And usually all of that's on our website page under Loon Pontoon Tours. And that's where you can sign up, and hope to see some folks on the water next year. Get some really good loon sightings on it.
Thanks. Terry has his hand up.
Yeah,
Yes.
thanks, Natasha. And thanks, Tim. One thing I wanted to mention is it would be great to have you as part of the Minnesota Environmental Partnership. I don't know if you know about it, 80 groups right now. We hope it will expand it, that are really working on environmental issues throughout the state. So it would be great to have you. The question that I had was just about toxics and what we know about lake water quality, things like lead fishing tackle, anything that you can say about that. I'd be curious.
Sure. So there's been pretty significant research in the northeast of the loon breeding range, so up in New Hampshire, Vermont, New York, Maine, where they've documented impacts of mercury toxins on loons, and that can impact. It might not always have a direct impact on mortality, but I believe they found impacts on just like neurological development and ability for chicks to develop normally, and adults to be able to feed their chicks and just act as usual. And so there's been then also some research that they've done linking as well, like acid rain to mercury accumulation to that accumulating in loons. And I know the New Hampshire Loon Group, the Loon Preservation Committee, is doing really extensive research on toxins that are and contaminants that are found in non-viable loon eggs, and they've even seen the presence, and an active area of concern right now is PFAS, and they've seen that come up in some of the loon eggs that have been sampled. And I think now they're still ongoing doing the research, trying to figure out what that means, what the tie-in there might be between human health, loons, and there. And I do believe that in some cases they might have been able to get that to trace back to some of the like fish consumption advisory levels, like kind of looking at the biochain effect with loons. And stop me at any point if I'm I'm just kind of speaking as things pop into my head. So if I'm going on a pathway that doesn't make sense, just let me know. Lead has been especially documented, especially in the Northeast. So I mentioned the veterinarian who has done a lot of loon necropsies. They have been doing those necropsies in the Northeast for a few decades and have found in New England 40% of loon deaths, or maybe this might have just been New Hampshire specifically, but 40% of the loon deaths were due to lead toxicosis. And they are still seeing significant impact. The national estimate for loon deaths due to loon lead poisoning is about 20 5%.
Huh.
And that's part of what we're doing right now at the Loon Center. If anyone reports a dead loon to us, we have it go down to the University of Minnesota Vet Lab. And we have a pretty small sample size since it started since 2021. And so far we've only had one case of lead poisoning, which is surprising, but have seen a few cases of boat strikes, unfortunately. But we're hoping to get some more statewide data for that for Minnesota in the coming years. But that has been definitely well documented in the Northeast as having a major impact on loons as well as mercury as well. There's been a lot of research on that impact on loons.
Thanks.
Well, yeah.
Yep. Elise, go ahead.
Thanks so much, Natasha. This has been really interesting. I use Merlin a lot. I haven't used eBird as much, and I do have it. I've noticed that they're seeming to be linked up a little more. Like I've just went in eBird and saw my Merlin observations are now like in eBird. Will the data that I'm like collecting in Merlin still be usable to scientists who wanted information from eBird?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, but I didn't know that Merlin now was uploading things to eBird. That is cool. Because I use Merlin a lot too for fun, and then I try to report to eBird. But I know that eBird is definitely used a lot by um scientists for all kinds of different species. I think there's been, over 300 application publications just based on eBird data. And of course, I have to relate it back to loons. I know a specific biologist who was looking at eBird data to start looking at if we're seeing any northward shift of loons on their wintering range, and if we're seeing more loons that are wintering on southern inland lakes versus the coast than we have in previous years. And so eBird data and anything that's getting, if it's from Merlin going into eBird, like that will certainly be used by biologists and researchers.
Cool, thanks.
I'm not seeing any other questions. So Natasha, thank you so much for spending some time with us this evening and talking to us about the Loon Center and about iNaturalist and these other apps. Just really, I found it really interesting. And I'm sure that when we share the video of this, that we'll make sure to include a link to the Loon Center. And just really appreciate you making the time to be here tonight. And I think everyone agrees with me. So just very grateful. So the November 1st Tuesday presentation is going to be by someone from the University of Minnesota Extension, Angela Gupta. And Angela is going to be talking about eco-anxiety, because there was some 2019 research that showed about half of young adults suffer from some type of eco-anxiety, climate-related stress. And talk a little bit about how you can turn that anxiety into something positive. So I look forward to having everyone back here in November to hear Angela give us a little bit of information on that. And unless there's any other questions that anyone has, I will say good night to everyone and thank you for joining this October 1st Tuesday meeting. All right. Well, good night, everybody.